I moved into a third-floor apartment last September because the rent was affordable and the building seemed safe, with controlled access and security cameras in every hallway. But 3 weeks ago, I woke up at 4 a.m. to find my sliding balcony door wide open and muddy footprints leading from my neighbor's balcony directly across my living room carpet toward my bedroom. The apartment was perfect for my budget. One bedroom with a small balcony overlooking the parking lot. The building was only 5 years old, so everything was modern and well-maintained. My neighbors seemed quiet, and I barely saw them. The unit to my left was a young couple who worked during the day, and the unit to my right was occupied by a single guy, maybe mid-30s. I'd seen him a few times in the hallway, and he'd nod, but he never spoke and kept to himself. My balcony was separated from his by a small divider, maybe 4 feet of concrete wall. Not connected, but close. You could technically reach across the gap if you tried, but I never thought about it or considered it a security issue. The first 2 months were completely normal. I'd come home from work, cook dinner, watch TV, sleep, wake up, and repeat. I felt safe. The building had good security with a locked entrance that required a key fob to get in and cameras everywhere. I'd leave my balcony door unlocked sometimes because I was on the 3rd floor and didn't think anyone could access it. That was my mistake. 3 weeks ago, I went to bed around 11 p.m. like usual. I locked my front door, but left the balcony door latched, not locked. I fell asleep easily, but woke up suddenly around 4 a.m. My bedroom was dark. I lay there listening, and then I heard it, a sound from my living room, like something being dragged across the carpet. I sat up and listened harder. The sound stopped. I got out of bed quietly, opened my bedroom door, and looked into the living room. The balcony door was wide open, the blinds were pulled aside, and cold air was coming in. I could see the night sky. My heart started pounding because I knew I hadn't left it open. I walked into the living room, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Muddy footprints on my carpet, leading from the balcony door across my living room toward my bedroom where I'd been sleeping. I froze and stared at them. They were large boot prints, recent, and the mud was still wet, glistening in the dim light from outside. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and followed the trail. The prints came in from the balcony, walked across my living room, stopped at my bedroom door, then turned around, walked back to the balcony, and disappeared. Whoever had been in my apartment had walked in, approached my bedroom while I was sleeping, and then left the exact same way they came. I ran to the balcony and looked out. My neighbor's balcony was right there, 4 feet away. I could see his balcony door was closed with no lights on, but I noticed something on his balcony railing. Fresh mud, like someone had climbed over it. I immediately called 911 and told them someone had broken into my apartment through my balcony. I grabbed my keys, ran out into the hallway, and knocked on the building manager's apartment. She came upstairs with me, and we waited in the hallway until 2 police officers arrived. I showed them the open door and the footprints. They took photos, measured the prints, and then knocked on my neighbor's door. When there was no answer, they asked the building manager to use her master key.
She opened his door, and the officers went in. They came back out 3 minutes later and said nobody was home, but they asked me to come look. I followed them into his apartment. His balcony door was wide open, just like mine had been, and on his floor was the exact same mud. The officers showed me his boots sitting by his front door, covered in fresh mud, with the same tread pattern as the prints in my apartment. The manager said his name was Derek. He'd lived there for 8 months and had no previous complaints. The officers took the boots as evidence, left a note for Derek to contact them, and filed a report. I went back to my apartment, locked every lock, pushed my couch against the balcony door, and didn't sleep the rest of the night. At 8 a.m., I heard footsteps in Derek's apartment. I called the police, and 20 minutes later, officers arrived and knocked on his door. I could hear Derek's voice through the wall, calm and cooperative, saying he didn't know what they were talking about. He claimed he'd been out late hiking at a nearby trail, which is why his boots were muddy, and said someone else must have broken in and used his balcony to access mine. The police couldn't prove otherwise. The boots matched the prints, but Derek claimed he had been nowhere near my apartment. The officers warned him they'd be watching and left. I stayed home from work, called a locksmith, and had a special lock installed on my balcony door that couldn't be opened from the outside. I also installed a small wireless camera pointed directly at my balcony door. This continued for a week. I checked the camera constantly and jump at every sound. Then one night around 2 a.m. I got an alert. Motion detected at my balcony door. I opened the camera app and watched the live feed. The door was still closed and locked, but there was a dark shadow moving on my balcony. The shadow moved closer to the camera, reached toward it, and the feed went black. The camera had been disabled. I called 911, grabbed a knife from my kitchen, barricaded my bedroom door, and waited until I heard police sirens. I heard footsteps running on my balcony, and then nothing. The officers checked my balcony and found my camera lens had been deliberately spray-painted black. They checked Derek's apartment. He answered in pajamas, claiming he'd been asleep. The officers searched his balcony and found a can of black spray paint, the exact same brand on my camera. But Derek calmly claimed he used it for a craft project and showed them a painted shelf. With no fingerprints on my camera, there was no direct evidence. I broke my lease and moved out 2 weeks later. Before I left, another tenant who used to live below him told me she would hear Derek on his balcony late at night, pacing and looking down at other balconies. Another tenant said Derek had asked to borrow tools to fix his balcony railing, and days later she noticed deep scratches on her balcony door lock, like someone had tried to pick it. I reported all of this to the police, but without concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. I never found out what happened. I moved to a different building with better security and no balcony, but sometimes I still think about those footprints leading from his balcony to mine, stopping at my bedroom door, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up.
I'd been living in my studio apartment for 6 months when I started hearing footsteps above me late at night, always the same pattern of pacing from the bathroom to the bedroom, until last week when I came home to find water dripping through my ceiling, and the police told me my upstairs neighbor had been dead for 3 days and someone else had been living in his apartment. The building was built in the 70s, so the walls and floors were incredibly thin. You could hear everything. The older man above me lived alone and was usually quiet. We'd nod in the hallway, but never spoke. But about 2 months ago, the pattern changed. I started hearing heavy footsteps late at night, always between midnight and 3 a.m., pacing from one end of his apartment to the other, over and over. At first, I figured he had insomnia, but it happened every single night. It started keeping me awake, lying in bed listening to the steps and feeling the vibrations through the ceiling. After 2 weeks, I went upstairs to politely ask him to keep it down, but he didn't answer the door. I left a note, but the pacing continued the next night with the exact same pattern. I complained to the building manager. She claimed she spoke to him and that he had apologized, but nothing changed. Every night, midnight to 3 a.m., pacing. Then last week, things got worse. I came home from work around 6 p.m. and immediately noticed water dripping steadily from my ceiling, creating a puddle on my floor. The ceiling was stained and bulging slightly. I called the building manager and we went upstairs together. She knocked, got no answer, and used her master key. The terrible, rotting smell hit us immediately. The apartment was completely flooded, with water pouring from the bathroom. The manager turned off the overflowing sink and called out for Mr. Patterson, but there was no answer. We checked the bedroom and found him dead in his bed.
Police and paramedics arrived and determined he had died of natural causes approximately 3 days earlier. But here's what didn't make sense. I had been hearing heavy footsteps pacing every single night for the past 3 days while he was dead. The police searched the apartment and realized the sink had been turned on deliberately and recently. There were fresh food wrappers and dirty dishes in the kitchen. Someone had been eating and staying there while the body was rotting in the bedroom. There were no signs of forced entry.
The police dusted for prints and found dozens of unknown fingerprints on the sink, the refrigerator, and the door handles. When they checked the building's security cameras, they found footage from 3 nights earlier showing a person wearing a hood entering Mr. Patterson's apartment late at night using a key. They stayed inside for hours, left around 4 a.m., and came back the next night doing the exact same thing. The police couldn't identify the person from the footage. When they interviewed me, I told them about the pacing. They said someone who likely knew Mr. Patterson had a copy of his key and was using the dead man's apartment as a hidden shelter. And I had been listening to them every night, pacing directly above my head. I moved out 2 weeks later because I couldn't sleep in that apartment anymore. Before I left, an older tenant told me Mr. Patterson had an estranged son with a severe drug problem. She said she had recently seen someone matching his description wandering the building late at night. The police investigated and found the son living in a motel across town. He denied everything, claiming he hadn't seen his father in years, and the police couldn't prove otherwise. The case went cold, but sometimes I still think about those footsteps pacing above me in the dark. I wonder if it was the son, using the dead man's home as shelter, walking circles in the dark next to a rotting corpse. I was just lying in bed downstairs trying to sleep, never suspecting that the footsteps I was hearing weren't from the living, but someone walking among the dead. I've lived in the same apartment for 4 years and always heard my neighbor through the wall, but never thought much of it until 2 months ago, when I started hearing my own voice coming from his side of the wall, playing back conversations I'd had in my apartment hours earlier, and I realized he'd been recording me. My apartment had standard cheap construction, so you could hear TVs and conversations easily. My neighbor to the right, a middle-aged guy named Richard who worked from home, was louder than most, but we coexisted peacefully. One evening, I was on the phone with my sister for about 20 minutes. I hung up, ate dinner, and got ready for bed around 10 p.m. That's when I heard a voice through the shared wall. I stopped and listened. It was my conversation with my sister, playing back word for word. I pressed my ear against the drywall. Richard was playing a crystal-clear recording of my private phone call from earlier that evening. My stomach dropped. The recording played for 5 minutes and then stopped. I was too terrified to knock on his door. A few minutes later, I heard another recording playing through the wall. It was a conversation I'd had with a coworker days ago. The audio quality was terrifyingly perfect. It sounded like he was standing directly inside my apartment recording me. I frantically tore my apartment apart, looking for hidden cameras or microphones, but found nothing. The recordings continued every night around 10 p.m. Richard would play back my phone calls or just audio of me muttering to myself while cooking. I hired a security company to sweep my apartment, and they found it. A small recording device was hidden deep inside the shared air vent that connected our units. He had placed it just on his side of the wall, and it picked up every single breath I took. The security team took photos for evidence, and I called the police. They knocked on Richard's door, and he let them in cooperatively. They searched his apartment but found no recording equipment. When they asked about the device in the vent, he calmly claimed he had no idea what it was and suggested someone else must have planted it. Since he had wiped it completely clean of fingerprints, they couldn't prove anything, so they just gave him a warning. That night, I heard scraping sounds inside the metal vent. I looked through the grates and saw fingers reaching through from his side, placing a brand new device. I took photos and called the cops again, but by the time they arrived, the vent was empty. Richard smoothly claimed he was just wiping down dust inside the duct. I screwed a heavy lock onto my vent cover so he couldn't access it anymore. But the psychological torture didn't stop. I would still hear my own voice playing through the wall every night. I had my apartment swept 3 more times but found no new bugs. That's when I realized he didn't need devices anymore. He had already recorded hundreds of hours of my life, and he was just sitting in the dark replaying old audio of me over and over again. I decided to fight back. I started playing fake recordings through the wall of me talking loudly about filing restraining orders and calling lawyers. The audio from his side finally stopped for a week. But then I came home to find my front door lock heavily damaged, like someone had violently tried to pick it. I called the police, but again, there were no prints. I installed a heavy-duty deadbolt and made my apartment a fortress. 2 weeks later, a handwritten letter was slipped under my door. It read, "I know everything about you. I've been listening for years. You can't keep me out." I took it to a judge and was granted a temporary restraining order. I thought it was finally over. But 3 days later, I woke up to find the sliding glass door to my ground floor patio wide open. Fresh, muddy footprints led from the outside, walked completely through my apartment, stopped dead at the wall I shared with Richard, and then walked back out. The police discovered Richard had completely emptied his apartment and disappeared. He was tracked down a week later in a different state and arrested for stalking and breaking and entering. I moved to a new building with no shared walls. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint sounds, and I wonder if someone is on the other side of the drywall, learning my voice, memorizing my patterns, and getting ready to step through an open door.